Back to the Nerdy Grail, and welcome to not only another franchise discussion-ish video, but also to the second Versus video on my channel. Now, the last time I did a Versus video, I did it on Has-Been Hotel versus Hell of a Boss, talking about which show I prefer and why. And that's exactly what this is going to be. But this time I'm looking at what is my favourite TV show of all time, what I've done numerous videos on this channel before. Of course, I'm obviously talking about Doctor Who. But the reason why I've got a mixture of classic series box sets and New Who box sets behind me is because if you've seen the thumbnail, you know what Versus video I'm doing today. That's right, I'm going to be doing Classic Who, so from 1963 to 1989 and including the 1996 TV movie starring Paul McGann, versus the modern era of the show from 2005 with Christopher Eccleston all the way up to the current era of the show, which has just ended with Ncuti Gatwa in 2025, The Reality War. So how's this video going to work? Well, first it is a little article that I would like to look at, which goes over some of the similarities and differences between classic and modern Who, where I'll also go over whether I agree with those points and why I agree with those points, or whether I disagree with those points. And then I'm going to just quickly break down both Classic Who and Modern Who and talk about their positives, their negatives, and then overall tell you which one I prefer and why. If you know me, you could probably gauge where I'm going to go with this video. But I don't know, my opinions have changed multiple times since I've started liking Doctor Who. I've been liking Doctor Who for over 20 years now. And my opinions have changed dramatically. But yeah, there is a special place in my heart for one of them, and by the end of this video, you're going to find out which one that is. But let's first go over to ScreenRant and have a little look at an article they published a little while ago, going over some of the similarities and differences between classic and modern Doctor Who. Okay then, so here we are on ScreenRant's website. So this is an article that was published back on the 31st of August 2024 by Jack Walters, who looked at Doctor Who 10 biggest differences between the eras, so the classic series and the modern series. So obviously, yeah, Doctor Who has been spanning for such a long time, and obviously since it's been going since 1963 to 2025, TV's changed, industries have changed, society has changed. There's been updates in special effects, you know, in what we can and can't do. And so things are going to look vastly different. And you'll notice that if you go back to watch a classic Doctor Who story to if you watch, say, one of the most recent series that's come out. But to a degree, that's sort of what makes Doctor Who special and why some people might prefer the classic series, because it's got that nostalgic charm to it. And that's what we're going to have a little look at in this article. So going all the way down, one of the first reasons they talk about is that modern Doctor Who companions receive more characterizations, and the classic Who didn't flesh out its sidekicks. So yeah, you will notice that a lot. In the classic series, a companion would just simply be picked up on Earth or maybe from another planet. You know, you would get variations of that, you know, like Adric came from another universe, from E-Space. They weren't all just from modern day Earth, but they were just a companion. They would just travel with the Doctor. They were there just to enjoy the universe and be basically us, wanting to travel in time and space. They might be there just as a screamer. They might be there as a fighter. They might be there as a lover. You don't know. But yeah, they didn't really build on much character. And they quite often didn't have any family that they really talked about. There was the occasional bit and pieces like Adric's brother or Tegan's Auntie Vanessa. You know, there was a couple of family members here and there, but for most part, it was just that companion and that companion alone. Whereas nowadays, in the modern era of the show, you know that character's family. You know whether they got brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, you know, whether they've got a boyfriend, a girlfriend, whether they're married, and you always go back and see their family. Like, obviously, from Christopher Eccleston with Rose going to see Jackie and Mickey, you know, you always had these family ties, so it builds on those characters. They've got layers to them, which to a degree, I do like that characters have layers like that, but I must admit, sometimes it can, like, take over the whole plot of the show, and you can get some strange arcs, and it becomes a bit more like a family drama as opposed to a sci-fi show travelling through time and space. So I don't mind that the classic series companions weren't fleshed out enough, or to a degree, but it made them simpler, made them easier to relate to, and I found them more enjoyable as a result of that, in my personal opinion. But that's not to say that the modern companions haven't been done great, and there's some brilliant ones, like the one on the screen right now. Amy and Rory, I think, are fantastic. Brilliant New Who companions, and yeah, are brilliant. So I do agree with that point. The second one we got, kissing in the TARDIS is encouraged. The Doctor is no longer afraid of romance. Now, I'm a massive person who's not a massive fan of the whole kissing in the TARDIS thing. You know, classic series, Doctors 1 to 7, no hanky-panky, no kissing, all this, that, and the other in the TARDIS, because that's not what this show is about. It's not about people hooking up, getting into relationships, and just snogging through time and space. You know, you're supposed to be battling monsters, saving planets, saving galaxies, and showing us the wonders of the universe. Not, ooh, who's going to be my next boyfriend, who's going to be my next girlfriend. Not a huge fan of that. So that's something that I personally think the classic series do better, because the modern era just seems to tie it into big, dramatic romances that's quite often not lead to nothing, and so you think they are pointless, like the whole 13th Doctor and Yaz thing. Completely pointless, and took away from some of the plots of some really good episodes, if I'm perfectly honest. Like, it's the only thing that I didn't like about Eve of the Daleks. But I adore Eve of the Daleks, if you've seen any of my ranking videos. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this kissing in the TARDIS. And the picture on screen with the 10th Doctor and Rose in Series 2 is exactly the point. Because Series 1 with Rose, with Christopher Eccleston, was brilliant. Season 2 was far too much of a romance between Ten and Rose, and it all built up in Doomsday in the end when they were all lovey-dovey on the beach. I didn't like that on Bad Wolf Bay. So I'm not a huge fan of that, if I'm perfectly honest, and that was something that only got introduced in New Who. Kind of classic Who if you want to count Paul McGann's 8th Doctor kissing Grace in that movie, but otherwise that's a New Who thing. The next thing they've got is modern Doctor Who has more overarching storylines, modern episodes are more connected. And that is very true. Classic episodes were very just to the point. This is what's happening this week. Next week we're going to be doing something different. There was very few overarching storylines or stories or plot threads. You know, like Series 12 of Tom Baker, you would have them searching for the TARDIS, and they have like the Time Ring, where stories like Genesis of the Daleks and Revenge of the Cybermen connect to each other. You'd have other things like the Black Guardian trilogy, or the E-Space trilogy, or the Key to Time, or the Trial of a Time Lord. Those would continue on into each other. And even early Hartnell, you know, that an episode would end, and then you get a cliffhanger to the next episode, and it would follow through. So there were connections, but there was very few and far between. It was very just, this is this week, and next week we're doing something different. Whereas modern Who have plot lines and big story arcs like Bad Wolf, or The Hybrid, or Flux, or The Timeless Children, or, you know, The One Who Waits, you know, things like that. Big story arcs and storylines that are built up through the series and then come to a climax at the end. Some done well, some done poor. I'm kind of mixed on the storylines. It depends on what they are. I think they are interesting and do get you engaged and make you think what's going to pop up next in that storyline. So I think it's quite nice. But I think I do like the classic approach of you don't have to do it all the time. You can have some just general nice adventures. You don't have to shoehorn it in all the time. But yeah, it is quite nice and does give you a bit of connectivity when you have overarching storylines, I will admit. Then you've got Doctor Who's modern era has way more comedy. The show isn't afraid to get silly anymore. Now, I kind of think that the modern era and the classic era almost have the same level of comedy. Come on, people, if you watch Patrick Troughton or watch Tom Baker in particular, look at stories like City of Death. Tom Baker is silly and goofy and coming up with the funniest lines I think I've ever heard on TV. I do admit it gets dark post Tom Baker, but the classic series has always been very silly and very, you know, I don't know, it's not afraid to almost make fun of the fact that its special effects weren't very good, but that's because it was very low budget back then. You know, there was not a lot they could do back then, but nowadays, obviously, with bigger budgets and better special effects, they can do grander things. But yeah, I will admit, yeah, the new series is quite silly, especially in the Matt Smith era in particular. I think it was quite silly. That reminded me a lot of the Patrick Troughton / Sylvester McCoy era of the show, which Sylvester McCoy was a goofball in season 24 in particular. But I would say, debatably, the modern era is quite dark. You know, season 1 was very dark. Series 2 was quite dark. It had silly moments, but it was also dark. The first season of Peter Capaldi was really dark. There's lots of dark elements to the modern era of the show, if I'm honest. Series 6 with Matt Smith was quite dark as well. I think it's about equal, personally. It's just about finding the right balance. And I think both classic and modern Who did get the balance right, in my opinion. But yeah, so I'm a bit unsure on that one, but I can see why they might think that, though. Doctor Who's budget allows it to compete with other sci-fi shows now. The Disney deal made things much easier. I will admit, yes, obviously the budget does play a huge role nowadays in Doctor Who, especially, you know, because back then, if you look at stories like Underworld, which is on my least favourite list for the classic series, yeah, the effects were atrocious. But that was because that was like the 70s, you know, things have changed now. There wasn't a lot they could do back then. They just had what they worked with. But it did mean that they did sort of fall behind a little bit, especially when films like Star Wars and stuff were starting to come out mid to late Tom Baker era. You know, you've got your late 70s kicks. But nowadays, obviously, Doctor Who with Disney budget, which also, you know, comes under Star Wars and Marvel, you know, they can compete with other sci-fi shows now in terms of their effects. Which Doctor Who's effects, I will say this, for Ncuti Gatwa era, there was moments where it looked phenomenal, really good, especially like in Interstellar Song Contest, when all the people are flying in the air and floating in deep space. I thought that looked really nice. So I will admit, yeah, it does make it, you know, visually more attractive. And so I will give points to Modern Who for looking more visually attractive. But there's something about the weird, quirky charm of just seeing a monster on a green screen and you know it's on a green screen, or seeing like the strings of puppets and stuff. I think it's funny in the classic series. I'm all for that nostalgia. But yeah, because sometimes it's all just too CGI for me, and obviously it's not real then, you know, if you get what I mean. But yeah, it does allow it to compete. The Time War changed everything in Doctor Who. The off-screen disaster may have saved the show. Yeah, I definitely think that the Time War gave the show a bit of a new purpose and a bit of new life. You know, because obviously after 26 seasons, 26 years, came up to the 30th anniversary with Dimensions in Time, the crossover with EastEnders, you know, the show had sort of been the same. And they were starting to plant some seeds in the McCoy era that the Doctor had extra secrets, you know, but they never ended up fleshing those out because the show got put on hiatus and cancelled. So the Time War gave it some new life, gave the Doctor new purpose, new character, you know, new challenges to overcome. And yeah, it just gave new relationships to old foes, like the Dalek relationship with the Doctor thoroughly changed, and I thought that was really good. I like that dark element to a degree. I do think, though, they milk it a lot nowadays, and we constantly tread the same ground over the time. I'm the last of the Time Lords, you know, I'm alone in the universe, there's no one left but me, you know, and we had that again, obviously, in order for the reveal of the Rani to come out. It was a repeat of season 3 with the Master. So it's got its positives and its negatives. I like the Time War. I just think I think we should have explored it a lot more on screen as well. Like we got glimpses in the Day of the Doctor 50th anniversary special. It would have been nice to see it a little bit more. Maybe we could get some on-screen stuff with Paul McGann and the Time War. That would be good. But yeah, so it brought new life to the show. I think it was definitely something it needed, and it is well welcomed, in my opinion. I just think they need to now try and implement it in a better way and not use it too much, because it's very rinse and repeat now. We've also got classic Doctor Who didn't give the Doctor much backstory. His history was mostly a secret. Yeah, you know, the show's called Doctor Who and he just calls himself the Doctor. You know, companions ask questions, what's his name, where'd you come from, this, that and the other. And especially in the early, you know, area of the show, Hartnell and Troughton, that was very much the case. You know, we didn't know anything about the Doctor. And by the time you got to John Pertwee, you finally knew that he was a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey. who has the ability to change his face, which, you know, that's 3 Doctors, and we only just got that. So that's 10, 11 years of the show, and we only basically know now where he's come from, and that the process of him changing his face is called regeneration. They didn't really, give the Doctor much backstory. Obviously, they gave each incarnation a different personality, but there was nothing to them, really. Whereas the New Who ones, you've got Eccleston, who has the trauma from the Time War. The 10th Doctor, who's this, like, romantic lover. The 11th Doctor, who's, you know, got the fear of that his death is incoming and he's destined to go to this place called Trenzalore where he's buried. The 12th Doctor not knowing whether he's a good man or not anymore and has to explore that and look into his darker persona. You know, the 13th Doctor having, you know, obviously the challenges of being a female incarnation now. You know, so all these different things, the Doctor's got a lot more to them. You know, finding about the timeless child, that the Doctor is now this ancient being that probably fell through a dimensional portal and isn't actually an original Time Lord. You know, so there is more stuff to the Doctor. And I think it does, you know, we need that. The Doctor can't be the same forever. And in a series about change, implementing stuff like that, I think can work if it's done right. That's the thing. That's the caveat here. It needs to be done right. Sometimes it has been, but there's other times where it hasn't been done well. Okay, next. Abandoning multi-part stories redefined Doctor Who. The change in format was a huge transformation. So basically it's trying to say that obviously classic Who, you'd have, say, Robot, parts 1, 2, 3, 4, Ark in Space, parts 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas nowadays you've got, you know, like the picture here, The Girl in the Fireplace, a 45-minute story, and then you would move on to the next story. So yeah, it depends on how you feel. I suppose if you want to know the conclusion quicker, having the 45-minute format works for you. But if you don't mind waiting and having a nicer build-up, because every classic story was a movie, about an hour and a half to an hour and 40, whereas New Who, you know, they're the equivalent of like a 2-parter classic series story, short and sweet. It depends. You know, it works, the quicker format sometimes, but also it means that some elements of the stories are rushed. Characters can be underdeveloped. You know, plot lines can be introduced and then easily forgotten about. So I think it swings and roundabouts with that, to be honest. Whereas in Classic Who, you knew every character was getting a decent amount of screen time and getting, like, you know, the service they need. So I think the longer, you know, the serialized format was better, in my opinion, because they don't always do them justice in like 40, 45-minute episodes, if I'm honest. But, you know, it is easier to digest, and modern viewers want that more easily digestible material, so this works. And, you know, new era of the show, new format, you know, you got to try things, you know. Now we've got modern Doctor Who is aimed at a worldwide audience. It's not just British anymore. Yeah, because obviously, you know, back in the day, you know, it was mostly just us here in the UK and all who got to see Doctor Who, whereas nowadays, obviously with Disney Plus and, you know, BBC America and all of that, those things, Doctor Who can be watched all over the world by almost anybody, you know, so... And obviously Doctor Who nowadays like goes to those different cultures, goes to those different places for filming, you know, does storylines, talks about their history, which is really, really nice and really, really good. And I think you need to bring in a wider audience. I think the show needs that, and I think it does that in a really, really good way. So I'm kind of glad to a degree that it's more worldwide, you know? So I totally think the modern era is a lot better for that. And the classic series, you know, obviously didn't do that as much. You wouldn't see many episodes on location in terms of going abroad on location. There would be lots of location footage, mostly in quarries in the classic series. But yeah, I think it is really, really good to expand that a little bit more. Doctor Who now has the advantage of nostalgia and uses it often. The show isn't afraid to tap in its own history. Now this is a little bit of an issue, though, especially now with RTD's second era of the show. Yes, you can tap into nostalgia, and me being a classic Whovian and a lover of the show since the 60s, yes, nostalgia, for me anyway, is brilliant. But when you've got a new audience, sometimes too much nostalgia can confuse an audience and make, you know, the impact of the story not make sense. Like, I imagine a lot of people who didn't watch classic series thought of like the power of the Doctor when Ace and Tegan showed back up to be confusing. They felt like maybe they should have been cheering at some of the returns but didn't really get it. You know, the reveal of Sutekh only makes sense if you know Pyramids of Mars. You know, Omega's only a big name if you've watched the classic series. You know, nostalgia's good and is fresh, but there's a video I watched a while ago saying that obviously nostalgia should be saved for anniversaries, and I sort of agree with that to a degree. I think in your core series, have the Daleks and the Cybermen and the Master, because they're your big villains, but try lots of new material. You don't need lots of returning things. And then when you get to an anniversary story, or the occasional finale, you know, not every series finale, but maybe every other, bring back a big villain, bring back a big character, especially in anniversaries, because then you're celebrating the show's history. And I think, yeah, it needs to be done a bit more sparingly. It's being done a bit too much now, if I'm perfectly honest. But yeah, so that is the article. Like I said, my thoughts are all over the place in terms of what I agree with and disagree with, but there's lots to talk about there, and I'm sure there's lots that you've been thinking about since seeing those. But let me bring that back together, and let me give you my overall thoughts on both classic and modern Who, and let you know which one I prefer. Okay, so now this part of the video is just going to be basically me quickly summing up classic, modern Who, you know, my positives of it, my negatives of it, and just giving you then my final verdict as to which one I prefer. So if I think about the classic series of the show then to start with, I'd say some of the positives of it for me is I quite like almost the cheapness of the show. This could also be seen as a negative, but I quite like the cheapness of the show. It gives it a bit of character. You know, sure, does it date it a little bit? Kind of, to a degree. But I think the cheesy, you know, the low quality is sort of excusable a little bit, because firstly, it's of the time. You know, what can things really do back then? You're talking like early 60s to late 80s. You know, things obviously did change over the course of those couple of decades, but at the same time, TV was still, you know, growing. You know, media was still growing, things were changing, and I quite like that. And also, they didn't focus too much on the effects. They focused more then on the plot and on the stories, and the stories for the most part were fantastic. There's some brilliant stories in classic Who. You know, in every decade, they've got some absolute bangers of stories. Like the 60s, to name a few, you've got like from the Hartnell era, the Dalek invasion of Earth is a fantastic story. The Romans, brilliant story. The Aztecs, great. The War Machines, the 10th Planet. Go into Troughton's era. There's loads. Tomb of the Cybermen, the Invasion. I don't know, the Web of Fear, Evil of the Daleks, The Mind Robber, Seeds of Death, The War Games. You know, John Pertwee, most of his era is fantastic. Spear from Space, Inferno, Terror of the Autons, The Daemons, Sea Devils, The Three Doctors, Carnival of Monsters, you know, tons of fantastic stories. The Time Warrior, Tom Baker, need I say more? Not just being biased because I love Tom Baker, but his whole first series is an absolute banger from start to finish, even Revenge of the Cybermen, which is the weakest story in the series, but I think it's still fun, because that's what classic Who does best, is even its worst stories are, for the most part, fun stories, whereas in modern Who, that's a bit different. But they're always fun. They've always got a weird, quirky charm to them, which is what I like. It's what keeps me engaged from start to finish. You know, but yeah, loads of brilliant stories. Some of my favourite Doctor Who stories then from the 80s, you know. Like I said, you've got like City of Death, Talons of Wing Chiang, Horror of Fang Rock, Keeper of Traken, Earthshock, Visitation, you know, Five Doctors, Resurrection of the Daleks, The Caves of Androzani is the best Doctor Who story of all time. You know, Vengeance on Varos, The Two Doctors, Revelation of the Daleks. You know, Sylvester McCoy's stories, Paradise Towers I love, Remembrance of the Daleks, Greatest Show in the Galaxy, The Curse of Fenric. You know, classic Who's got some bangers from start to finish. And there's loads more that I could mention, but those are just to name a few. But that's still a lot of stories. But yeah, it's got a great charm to it, classic Who. I love the music. The soundtracks are great. You know, they really fit the time period. Like, you can tell when you're watching a 60s, 70s or 80s Doctor Who story. I've done loads of quizzes with my fiancée online where we've had to just listen to the music and we can tell. But it is eerie, it is creepy, it is mystical. You know, I love it. It's whimsical as well. I love it. It's got a weird, nice charm to it. As well, you know, just I like the companions also being companions and the Doctor being the Doctor. You know, like classic series, you know, quite often or not, you would have companions also from outer space. You know, they would be aliens. You know, obviously you had loads of companions that were from Earth, but for the most part, you had companions that were from here, there, and everywhere. You know, like Ace was someone who was from modern day Earth, but then was taken to another planet, and so was essentially like an alien by the end. You know, you've got companions like Turlo, who is an alien. You know, Chameleon, Adric, Romana, so another Time Lord as a companion. K9 was introduced in the classic series as well. You know, tons of companions. Susan. You know, there was lots of companions who were taken out of time. Not necessarily aliens, but they were taken out of time themselves. You know, like Leela's technically a descendant from the humans, but was, you know, in a long, long line, and, you know, so she was different to a degree, you know? I like that, whereas modern era of the show, it's just modern day Earth Girl or Earthman, you know? There's no, like, alien companions, really, in the modern era of the show. You could maybe name, like, one or two. Most of them are just modern day, young Earth Girls, is pretty much what it is. You know, and John Sims says it best in The End of Time, saying, oh, he loves playing with Earth Girls. You know, but yeah, I love that about Classic Who. His companions felt different. Sure, they didn't get developed always in the best ways, which Modern Who does do a little bit better, but they almost do it too much the other way. But Classic series still made a companion feel like a companion, and the Doctor feel like the Doctor. You know, and we didn't have any of that silly romance. So they really focused in on the monsters, which were creative as well. And they also travelled to different planets and different times. Almost every week there was something brand new and different. Sure, they would use quarries a lot, which is a bit of a negative, you know, the lack of location changes. But there was still a good charm to it, and you still had a lot of variety. Whereas now, if I shift over to the modern era of the show, you know, sure, you get the good character development now of the Doctor having more backstory with the Time War, which is really good, and it gives him another layer, which I really like. You know, and the companions have a lot more to do. And obviously the special effects and visually, New Who looks a lot better. And it is going to, because that's how progression works. And I also do think that, you know, for a more modern audience, changing the format of the show from the serialized format from classic series to era, you know, does work. Okay, degree. But I think also at the same time that sort of takes away the charm a little bit. But also when talking about like giving the Doctor character, obviously that's not to mention obviously the romance stuff, which I'm not a fan of in Modern Who. It becomes more like a soap opera, you know, like you'd see like on EastEnders or Coronation Street. You know, I don't like that sort of thing. That's not my cup of tea, and that's not what Doctor Who was about. And Doctor Who wasn't like that for over 30 years, so it didn't need to be like that then. Now pretty much going forward, where it's all about relationships. It should be about saving the world and going off into time and space. But yeah, so if I'm perfectly honest, if I was to say which era of the show I prefer between classic and modern era, I'm going to give it to the classic series. And you probably predicted that from the start of the video that I was going to go this way. But I can't help it. I love the classic series. I think it's also tiny bit of nostalgic bias because obviously I started with Classic Who. Yeah, despite what you might think, yeah, I started with Classic Who. My very first Doctor Who story was The Hand of Fear with Tom Baker. I watched numerous classic Doctor Who stories before even delving into the modern era of the show. Like I said, The Empty Child Doctor Dances was the most recent episode on TV from when I jumped on in Modern Who. So before that, I'd seen a load of classic Doctor Who's. I'd seen almost every classic Doctor at least once before joining the modern era of the show. So Classic Who holds a special place in my heart. If I'm going to put on a Doctor Who story, I quite often put on a classic story over a modern story. Although at the moment, me and my fiancée are rewatching modern Doctor Who-esque stuff because we watched Class together, and we're currently in the process of rewatching the Sarah Jane Adventures. So I'll probably do a video on that at some point. Which I do love the spin-offs that have come from the modern era of the show as well. I will mention that. But yeah, I do prefer classic series as opposed to modern series. But that's not to say the modern series is bad. And if you prefer the modern era, good on you. And I can see every reason as to why you might do so. But just for me personally, if I had to choose, I'm going to go with the classic series of the show. But that's going to be it for my little discussion stroke versus video on classic versus modern Doctor Who. I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please like it by giving it a thumbs up and comment down below which one do you prefer and why. And subscribe if you are new. But for now, this is the Nerdy Girl signing off. I hope you've had an amazing day and I will see you all next time. Bye for now, everyone.